Take your seats so we can get started with the second half of the day. Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I know it's a Friday and you're giving up your day to be here, but these are very important discussions that we're having, and I look forward to continuing these fruitful conversations. Without further ado, I did want to invite our panelists who will be speaking on genocide, ideology, and denial to come forward so we can begin our session. All right, everybody. Thank you again. So we are very privileged to have a distinguished panel here. And for any of you who are just joining us for the afternoon session, we've already had some wonderful conversations, and I have no doubt that today's panel will be just as engaging. And we will start off, the structure will be that I will introduce the panelists. They will go up and give us some brief remarks. Come back down, and then we'll go down the row. And when our panelists are done, we will open it up for a Q&A, and then, keep it moving. So I will begin with Dr. Usta Kayitesi, who's sitting right there. She's the Deputy Chief Executive Officer and currently acting CEO of the Rwandan Governance Board, and came all the way from Rwanda to be here with us today. She's a non-permanent commissioner at the Rwandan Law Reform Commission. She previously served as the principal of the College of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Rwanda and the vice chairperson at the Technical Support Team Commission to the Parliament of Rwanda, and was part of the review of the Constitution that was for Rwanda in 2015. She also served as a deputy dean and head of department and then faculty of law at the National University in Rwanda. Dr. Kayitesi holds a PhD in law from the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands and a master's of law from the University of Ottawa in Canada, as well as a BA from the National University of Rwanda. She's published a lot in different areas of law, human rights, and gender, including a book which is entitled Genocide, Gender, and Sexual Violence, The Legacy of the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and Rwanda's Ordinary Courts and Gacaca Courts. Please welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I want to thank the organizers of this symposium for giving me the opportunity to come and pay tribute to the victims of the genocide and honor the lives of the survivors, but also to have a moment to do the right fight that we should be doing as humanity. I think it's a duty on every human being today to become human in April, and the easier way of becoming human in April is becoming Rwandan, or at least being friends with Rwandans. The testimonies that we had this morning reflect the weaknesses of humanity, but also they reflect the strength of humanity. And I think we stand as individuals to make choices in the weaknesses and in the strength of humanity. And that's why I'm going to be discussing briefly on genocide ideology and denial. I know my colleagues will be speaking about the stages of genocide, and I know we've had a very good background of genocide as an offense and the realities of Rwanda earlier on. I am going to go back to the basics. Today we use the term genocide because given the histories of World War, given the experiences of the Holocaust, the term genocide became a legal term. And this term has a meaning. Of course, I will not go back to the discussions that was already made earlier on. Dr. Kamantali earlier said, like any crime, the crime of genocide has a mens rea. And the perpetrators of genocide, their ideology, politically they call it an ideology. I think legally I will call it a mens rea. They have an intention. It's not a spontaneous act. It's not something that just happens. It's something that they purpose to do, they intend to do. And by that purpose and intention, they identify who to target. There was a discussion earlier on how we qualify the genocide against Tutsi. I will go back to some of the elements of the definition of the crime of genocide as put out in the UN Convention, and just mention the targeted group: national, ethnic, racial, or religious. At least those are the parameters that the convention looked at on determining the crime of genocide. So in Rwanda, and over the discourses of denial, people have had a discussion on how we call it. A question earlier came up. When you call it a genocide against Tutsi, I become uncomfortable. I do not, that's why we are in a university. A university is a space where ideas become more universal, where ideas get discussed, but also it should be a space where reality gets documented, where facts get qualified for what they are. So if we called it, let me use the if we called it the Rwandan genocide, like sometimes people call it, legally speaking, we would be changing the targeted group. Because remember, the 4 groups are national, ethnic, racial, or religious. If we called it the Rwandan genocide, the targeted group would have been Rwandan nationals. And therefore, the perpetrator would have needed another definition on who targets that particular group, which is Rwandan nationals. That would mean also that some of the Rwandans that today come out as perpetrators, because one of the strongest uniqueness of the genocide against Tutsi, it was within Rwanda by Rwandans against Rwandans. But in the Rwandan context, given the description that Dr. Kamantali mentioned earlier, the Rwandan people, even though historically not necessarily ethnic groups, by the time of the genocide, both the perpetrators and the victims had every reason to know and identify who was Tutsi and who was Hutu. So it is not a genocide against Rwandans, just Rwandans for being Rwandans. We do not speak about the religions of these Tutsi that we are speaking about, and certainly they had religion. But it's not a genocide against their religion. It wasn't a genocide against their nationality. It wasn't a genocide against their race. It was a genocide against them as Tutsi, qualified in the historical understandings, as earlier said, and targeted for who they were at the time in their minds and in the minds of the perpetrators. And that's why I think, speaking in a legal environment, but in a moment where historical clarity must be really emphasized, this is genocide against the Tutsi. For the reasons that I've given, anything that turns around that, intentionally, duped, unintended, really adjusts the reality, adjusts what the genocide, what the minds of the perpetrators were, and the reasons of the victimization of the victims. The victims were victimized for being Tutsi. The perpetrators had intended to destroy in whole or in part a population of Rwanda called Tutsi. And that's why I think the how we name this qualifies actually in the genocide ideology itself, but also in the denial ideologies or in the denial aspects. I know it's a discussion that has had ways of how people see it, but I think historical clarity, as I earlier mentioned, and telling the truth. Commemoration is also telling the truth. I think the biggest honor you would do to the victims and the survivors is to uphold the truth and the experiences they went through, and this symposium is also about that in particular. So I will, as I earlier mentioned, my focus is on genocide ideology and denial. The discussants earlier explained the historical journey that Rwanda went through in creating the victims, in implementing the genocide, and in achieving the extermination level. Part of the denial has sometimes been on when the genocide started. Some of the deniers have had this discussion. When the airplane was shot on April 6th, we are yet to find out who shot the airplane, then that triggered the genocide. I'm not going to be unfair and do the discussion of the stages of the genocide because I know my colleagues are going to do that, but it's also important that we understand the genocide from the perspective of the stages. And therefore, the extermination and the very first extermination finds itself in the month of April, June, July, but the stories of the Tutsi go beyond those and go earlier than those months. But as I said, that is a discussion for those who are going to be speaking about the stages. May I say that denial is part of the stages of the genocide. What only differs is that the perpetrators of the genocide, so those who killed and raped, are not the only perpetrators of deniers. So in the stages of the genocide, the size of the perpetrators may diminish or expand, depending on the side you choose to be on. There are so many people who end up becoming part of the denial area by how they qualify the genocide, by how they discuss the numbers, and by how they justify the perpetrators. Denial must manifest itself in those elements that I'm just mentioning. The elements of justifying the perpetrators, alternating the truth, and sometimes trying to justify the double genocide discourse. So today as we speak, there are some people who might even have not been born when the genocide happened, but who have vehemently committed themselves to justifying the genocide, or to misrepresent the truth, or to misunderstand that. As I said, that's why symposiums like these are very important. We need to be fair enough to humanity by protecting the young on understanding these matters. And I think history will record us wrong if we become the eighth stage of the genocide, which is also the same. Now, why do I say it's the same? The same ideology that creates the genocide. Remember, it's a crime whose intention, whose special intent to destroy gives it the highest space it sits in. Now, that intention to destroy stays on up to the other stages of the genocide. When we are in the denial stage of the genocide, genocide has its way of going on. It continues through the denial stage. And unfortunately, we either become perpetrators of the genocide denial area, or we become silent, or we create confusion on others. So also part of the discourse of the deniers of the genocide is to create a confusion about memory. In Rwanda, we have chosen to remember renew, and unite. We don't remember to become deniers. We do not remember to become haters. We remember because history has given us that duty. It has given us the duty to honor those that suffered and died out of human suffering, out of human decision, out of human language. Earlier on, my colleagues spoke about the role of propaganda in creating the genocide mindset, in creating the genocide ideology. It is the role of us all to either fight denial or unfortunately be indifferent about it, or at times participate in it. So the discourse of denial that I mentioned earlier on, for the intentional deniers, because aware that history happened somewhere else, not close to all of us, how we understand, how we know it, sometimes depends on how much we are exposed. I had a conversation with somebody I was traveling next to on the plane, which is normal. You're seated next to one another and you're going to be traveling for 8 hours. I thought it was very human that we introduce ourselves. We definitely didn't introduce ourselves until about 4 hours on the journey. And eventually, we introduced ourselves. He's in the IT engineering world, and he asked what I was coming to do. We spoke, and he told me, you know, it's the first time I'm hearing about that story. The risk of somebody hearing about the genocide the first time is not just a Rwandan history. When you measure the Holocaust, at least half of the population of the world knows something about the Holocaust. As we transmit knowledge, as we use social media, as we use all the facilities that surround us, symposiums like these are great opportunities to share knowledge and share facts and share experiences. Thank you to those who shared their experiences again, because that removes the lack of clarity that at times creates the right and healthy environment for genocide deniers to go on. So the factual aspect, sometimes the deniers will agree with the factual aspect, but they will alternate that truth. So they will try to say, the genocide was an instance, a reaction, because the plane of the president crashed. Who reacts against a 4-year-old? Because the plane crashed. What is the place of a 4-year-old in a political environment where the plane crashes? What is the place of a 14-year-old being raped until the rapist has been convinced that that's part of a national duty in their mind and in their behavior? So the definitions and understanding of the victims go beyond the political discourse of the shooting of the plane, whoever shoot it and for whatever reason. The identity of the victims is purely who they belong to, in this case, the ethnic group of the Tutsi. And we cannot alter that truth by justifying a political happening, which might have triggered the widespreadness of the extermination, but which wasn't the first act of extermination and not necessarily the last act of extermination, and which does not justify why the experiences of the victims get denied today. So genocide ideology also stands out through, genocide negation and denial stands out through negating the facts. Choosing not to believe the stories of the victims. Altering the discussion we had earlier, I said, you know, the discussion ended on how do you define moderate Hutus? Perpetrators is not equivalent to Hutus. There are many Rwandans, and I like how it ended. There are many Hutus, Rwandan Hutus, who did not become genocide perpetrators, who did not carry the genocide ideology. That is how we have chosen to understand the realities of the genocide. We recognize today as a nation the braveness of those who chose, and I think the colleague who was on the panel mentioned that very clearly. The victims were Tutsi. Just like in the Holocaust, if you went just by the numbers, the biggest number of those who were killed together goes beyond the number of the Jews. But the instances of their death were not motivated by the same ideology, neither by the same mens rea. They were killed either because they were obstacle or because the killers were just into the killing beyond the victims. But the purpose, the intention was not to target them directly. So the other things that caused the negation in some situations have been to justify that genocide actually happened on either sides. The United Nations and the International Criminal Tribunal that was created thereafter have confirmed that there was no evidence whatsoever that was intended to kill all the Hutus. And therefore, there was no genocide in that regard against the Hutu. On the other side, sufficient evidence stood out. There is a legal notice internationally that confirms that the genocide against Tutsi happened, that Tutsis were targeted for over a time, and that the perpetrators knew and intentionally chose to wipe out the Tutsis, despite those that survived in their absence. As I conclude, I want to mention the issue of numbers. While it's important, and I like the speaker earlier who said, we speak about more than 1 million victims, not because they are 1 million, but because each of them matters. It's 1 million of each. It's 1 million of ones. It's 1 million of mothers, individual mothers. It's 1 million of individual babies. It's 1 million that brings together individual grandfathers, people who had names, people who had character and personality, and people who had emotions, who could love, who could feel, who could judge, and who I think judge us in many ways. Those individuals unfortunately died in a period that was very intense. 100 days is too short for 1 million, but it's too short for an individual either. It's too short to take our lives. And in the situation of Rwanda, it took more than 1 million. It took millions of Rwandans to participate and execute the genocide. So when we discuss, I know some of the deniers go around the number discourse. They will say, well, because they said, when the deniers of the Holocaust have always said, you know, they say it is 6 million, but when you do a very good mathematical count, they are actually 5 million. And therefore, because they are not sure about the numbers, then let's doubt the facts. Families that have lost individuals, a country that has lost citizens, one of them dying innocently is big enough. That's a human rights culture. That should be the right human rights spirit. An individual is human enough if their death is going to cause any concern. But in this particular case, it's important that we speak the numbers as they are, for it's an individual recognition of each of them. But also it's a greater recognition of how efficient the killers were able to kill them in such a short time, in a big number. May I go back to the legal understanding of this? Genocide is not a crime of numbers. It's a crime of intention. If the perpetrators were only able to kill 10 of the million Tutsi, their intention would have stayed. Had we had the opportunity that those who stopped the genocide were able to stop it much earlier, and we saved a great number of that million, the genocide would still have happened. Because it's about the purpose and intention and ideology of the victimization more than the number that they have been able to actually exterminate. Genocide is not an offense of extermination only. For the perpetrators, rape and sexual violence was a form of committing it. So killing is part of the implementation of the genocide, but it's not the only way that you commit a genocide. The numbers, therefore, sometimes our discussion spends so much on the numbers and we forget the great spirits mentioned here earlier of those surviving and living on with the consequences of the genocide. I want to thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaitesi, for synthesizing a lot of the conversations we had earlier and being able to place them into the landscape of genocide ideology and how this can manifest when we're having discussions around genocide. And it's a great lead into our next discussion around the stages of genocide. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Marcus Steiner. He's the program coordinator at the Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Terre Haute, Indiana. He also conducts research alongside the Center for Genocide and Research Education in Longmont, Colorado, where he previously worked as the Director of Development. Marcus Steiner is currently, he holds a Master's in History from Arizona State, and he's currently pursuing a doctorate in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Gratz College. His research focuses on identifying, quantifying, and indexing risk factors for genocide and mass atrocities in order to create accessible risk models for use by decision makers. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you.
All right, and thank everyone so much for having me here today. You will have to forgive me. I discovered I was on this panel at about 9 o'clock this morning. So, so you will have me for the next two. I'm very excited to be on this particular panel, though, as the stages of genocide and genocide risk factors do fall squarely within what my research covers. So let's go ahead and jump on into it. So Rob Stan has developed a model of 10 stages of genocide, the first of which is classification, specifically looking towards the classification of individuals within society. Classification occurs in normal society, everyday society. We see how we identify ourselves as methods of classification. When it comes to genocide and stages of genocide, classification becomes a factor of dichotomization. We see that with the Rohingya and the Burmese, the legal versus illegal immigration, the Germans and the Jews, the Tutsi and the Hutu. And by creating this dichotomization, those societies become more prone to genocidal violence. Symbolization. So it is kind of your defining classifications. It defines this dichotomization that forms in societies. Some things we might be more familiar with would be the Star of David during the Holocaust, used to indicate who within society had Jewish ancestry. Also, more modern times, the blue scarves, those who came from the eastern zones of Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. Words become more effective in dichotomizing groups. So now, no longer are you simply identified as a religious Jew, a cultural Jew. Now, that carries a connotation of a negative aspect within society. So it carries that kind of initiation of the us versus them dynamics. Discrimination, something normally fairly straightforward. And the concept and the scope of genocide, however, it looks specifically towards the denial of rights through legal means, through traditional custom, and through pure political clout. So a kind of unofficial policy of discrimination supported at the official levels. Again, some common examples of this would be the 1982 Burmese citizenship law. So after the first round of genocidal violence perpetrated against the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar in 1978, 4 years later, the Burmese government passed this 1982 Burmese citizenship law, which stripped Rohingya of any legal citizenship within Burma, thereby justifying their viewpoint of the Rohingya as illegal immigrants that had come over during the French colonization. Again, harkening back to the Holocaust, after all, I do come from the Holocaust Museum, the Nuremberg laws implemented in 1930s Germany. Dehumanization. Here's where we really get into that meat of the dichotomization and where we start to see the true development of genocidal ideology and violence. Dehumanization is aimed strictly at stripping a victim group or potential victim group of their humanity. Again, we've heard earlier where the Tutsi referred to as cockroaches. That is actually very common terminology used throughout 20th century genocides. Because as our director at Candles would say, the first thing you want to do when you think of a cockroach is to step on it. So, with that in mind, the idea of this dehumanization is to overcome an individual's normal moral abhorrence towards committing murder. It justifies a forcible shift in power dynamics that is kind of a self-fulfilling cycle. By elevating a perpetrator group and shifting power dynamics, it further isolates and ostracizes the victim group, thereby kind of redoubling this dehumanization factor. And in this stage of genocide, you start seeing these hate-based propaganda policies becoming more and more common. It's where you start seeing a lot of official propaganda that acts towards really pushing towards that us versus them dynamic. Organization. So this is where we start to get to the intent behind genocide. Genocides are not something that just spontaneously happens. There are certainly instances where you see a single event that appears to be the spark for a genocide, but there's ample lead up and ample planning behind that. It ties to intent at the governmental level. So a large aspect of organization is the attempt to displace responsibility from the government onto external or internally operating groups. So you have such as mob violence within the 1984 genocidal violence against the Hindus in India, or the violence in Darfur, the Janjaweed, were utilized as a tool of genocide as an independent, quote-unquote, militia group. It is it's also indicative of large-scale preparation, so stockpiling of weapons and arms, like we see in the genocide against the Tutsi. Polarization. This is where us versus them comes to a head. This is where it is officially, these people are our enemies. This is where the invisible violence really starts to take off, kind of get off the ground level. It really overlaps with some of the other factors. You'll see a lot of these factors do overlap with each other because we get to this official policy of polarization. So the same way policies can be discriminatory, they can also be polarizing. They are meant to push individual groups to as far of extremes as they can get. And when that happens, moderate groups become the target, whether of violence or of incarceration. Moderate groups are often the best tool the international community can utilize to prevent genocide. So these groups are often taken out of the equation at this stage by a potentially genocidal regime. Preparation is a lot like organization. It is, however, more of an action step. It is where the ties with the organizations become formalized, so where the Janjaweed officially begin working with the Sudanese government. Formal policies and plans begin to be developed, so the final solution in the instance of the Holocaust, or the quote-unquote immigration policies initiated by the Burmese government to plan the removal of the Rohingya Muslims. It has the establishment and arming of specialized units who, with the intent to commit the genocidal acts, such as the Einsatzgruppen and the Holocaust. And also you start seeing the incitement language. So the, if we do not act, they will kill us kind of mentality within the perpetrator group. Persecution is where the visible and invisible violence come to a head. You start seeing more visible aspects of violence, such as property expropriation. So victim groups begin being stripped of their property. They begin having forced symbolization. So it's no longer just a well-enforced law that these symbols be worn. It becomes punishable by arbitrary execution, arbitrary incarceration. Formal policies of segregation often occur during this time, up to and including the utilization of ghettos and concentration camps. And it is the true beginning of what many scholars would recognize as genocidal violence. It is the beginning of the elimination of the victim groups. Extermination is by far the most visible action. It is the initiation of the preset plans to commit genocide. It is a full-scale killing of the victim groups. And perhaps most importantly, in the concept of genocide prevention, it is also the stage that can spur future genocides as acts of retribution. Oftentimes in areas where there's consistent political turmoil, multiple genocides over the span of decades, genocidal violence can be utilized as a tool of retribution against what could be seen as former perpetrator regimes by perceived victim groups. And the final stage, and perhaps the most important in the context of our conversation today, is denial. It is really the only true sequential stage of genocide as far as Stanton's research is concerned. It must occur after the beginning of genocidal violence. It consists of any action utilized to cover up evidence, so anything from mass burials to cremations, seen in the Cambodian mass graves and Nazi crematoria utilized in the death camps, and tampering with witnesses and documentation, so the destroying of documents that show inmates within prison camps, or threatening and intimidating witnesses to prevent them from testifying on an international stage. It is the greatest indicator of future genocidal violence, according to genocide risk factor analyst Barbara Harf, because it allows for a genocidal regime to commit its acts relatively unpunished, which is one of the largest contributors to a perpetrator regime committing a second act of genocide. So what does all of this really mean? So Rob Stanton's stages of genocide are a combination of genocide risk factors, so things that will set the stage where we can recognize that genocide is possible to occur, and genocide indicators, which indicates that genocidal violence has already started and intervention is a must. It's not a checklist of any sort. Not every stage is required to recognize or to qualify genocidal violence. It is, with the exception of denial, not a sequential list. You don't have to go stage 1, 2, 3, all the way down to 10. Stages can be skipped, stages can be taken out of order. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of overlap, especially with the expansion of the list from 8 to 10. And resolving one stage is not sufficient to halt genocidal actions. Simply because you can step in and cease a policy of official persecution does not mean that the preparation for genocide is not still occurring. It does not mean the government is still not organizing militia and terror groups to commit genocide in its stead. It is best utilized as an alert tool, an early warning system, where the international community can recognize, how many of these 10 stages are ongoing, which stage is ongoing, and how much could it contribute to genocidal violence, and be a very good indicator of when is a time to step in and intervene. Yeah, and that would be the end, apparently.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcus, for walking us through the stages of genocide and having a proactive stance around alert tools and how we can start to identify them quickly and act upon it. And now I will introduce Dr. Kamatali, who will speak to us about genocide prevention in the space of academia and the role of scholars. For all those who were not present earlier today, Dr. Jean-Marie Kamatali is a tenured professor of law and the director of the Center for Democratic Governance and the Rule of Law at Ohio Northern University Law School. He is a former dean of the law school at the University of Rwanda and has taught at different universities, including the University of Notre Dame Law School, the Indiana University in South Bend, Kent State University, and Leuven University in Belgium. His publications have focused on accountability for genocide and crimes against humanity, the rule of law, human rights, and U.S. First Amendment. He is a regular consultant for the UN Office of Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to kind of clarify things here that I really believe in First Amendment. So I know that there are people who say, hey, do you believe? So I believe that people have freedom of speech, and I believe in academic freedom. But I believe also, and it should be understood, that the First Amendment can be used for good and for evil. The same way academic freedom can be used for good and evil. So here comes then the choice. You have to choose which side you can be on and choose whether you're going to be the human who has the rights, but also you can balance your duties. And this is where the whole concept of then who should balance that. Should the individual choose to balance that? And if that person is not responsible enough to make that choice, who should make that choice? And that's where also, as we discuss the role of scholars, we should not discuss the role of scholars without discussing the role of institutions that are teaching people, because scholars are not people living outside there. They belong to institutions, and we cannot look at individuals without looking at institutions where they belong. And that is where I think I really love very much, and I'm very glad to be speaking here today because of that. One of the person who inspired me is Father Hasberg, who is the founder of a lot of good things in this university, when he said that our lives in education have any meaning or significance. If our lives in education have any meaning or significance, it will be in our reading the signs of the times and in educating the young of our times in the vision and values that will civilize and make for reasonable human progress and lasting peace on earth. So this is actually, if you look at that saying, it makes sense that if you look at the university here, you find that, and this is very important to make a distinction between institutions and individuals, is that you look at the good things scholars have done in general. And that's why when we talk about scholars who are involved in denying genocide and denial and everything, we should not kind of like lose sight of the majority of scholars who are doing a fantastic job teaching about issues of prevention of genocide, teaching issues of peace, teaching issues of human rights. And that is very important to keep in mind, because I'll be talking about the bad apples. We have to understand that institutions that are really dealing with teaching some of the issues, and we talk about the Kroc Institute, there are many institutions that have the mission. In the morning, there was a speaker telling us about how she spends time teaching high school kids about genocide, teaching them about all these issues. And it's really very important to keep in mind that there are many institutions, there are many organizations, there are many scholars who have worked toward creating peace, creating a prevention of genocide, and really making the world a better place. And these are the majority. But unfortunately, we have lived in a society, also we live in a society where scholars have played a significant role in Holocaust. Holocaust had people were thinking, planning, and everything. Those are scholars. In Rwanda, if you look at the context of Rwanda, the ideology was developed by scholars, it was taught by scholars, it was taught in schools. And sometimes the problem with young minds, we go to school, we learn things, and then we don't realize that some of this information is twisted. So the example, for instance, I was giving you about the history of Rwanda. If you look at the way history of Rwanda was taught, you look at it now, you say, oh, now I get it. Because before, we had no idea. If you look at the way history was taught in Rwanda, it was based on this theory of Hutus being from, I don't know, did they say from Chad or from wherever, I don't know, and Tutsis being from Ethiopia. So that theory was taught in school. And it was not developed by anybody, it was developed by researchers. And it had some basic information that was supporting that, oh, Tutsis, they look like people from Ethiopia, so this is how they got here. The Hutus, they came from this. So you look at the history, say the Rwanda was first occupied, or the land of the Batwa, who is just the third ethnic group, they call it. And then came the Hutus, and then came the Tutsis. And for an innocent mind, it may sound like, wow, now I'm learning something. But the colonial mind, the whole division, the whole aspect of telling people that there are the people who are here, and then others came after. So they're kind of defining who go there first, who was the first occupier, and that is the second, and then third. So these are issues that are developed by researchers, and those researchers, they develop that in their mind, thinking that they're contributing to the society, but they end up destroying the society that they cannot live in. If you look at the Holocaust, you find that the scholars who were behind the Aryan race, they were developed by academicians who explained what is an Aryan. I mean, if you look at it, what is that? So all these aspects, measuring noses and measuring these are not ordinary people developing that. There is always a scholar behind it who is kind of pushing it. If you look at the issues in Cambodia, you find that most, even things that don't make sense. I mean, if you look at the genocide in Cambodia, which was based on people speaking foreign languages, or people are educated, and you develop that and you create a theory about it, and the simplification. So the problem with academicians, they have a capacity to simplify things in a way that young people or people learning will learn it. And the problem of role playing. So scholars play a significant role because you standing here, you're talking to people who want to get grades. They want to get, knowledge. They want to get, so the kind of getting that knowledge is really the role. So the responsibility of scholars has to be re-understood by scholars themselves. As much you understand the concept of freedom of speech or academic freedom, it comes with the responsibility that when you're standing in front of people, whatever you say, you have to be able to stand behind it. No say it and then disappear and they feel like, oh, I did my job. This is not a job you do because of money. This is not a job you do because you have to have a calling. And that is very important to keep in mind when we talk about, so the scholars contributed kind of like as a negative, but there are also scholars who contributed really in positive side. If you look at, for instance, here, I mean, the first time I came here, and I met people. I have met American high school kids, American undergraduate students who read more books than most Rwandans I know. They read really good books. When you meet them, you talk to them, they can cite you 5 books on Rwanda. They read good books because those books are assigned to them in high school, in undergraduate. And you talk to them even as a Rwandan, say, oops, I don't know that book. And this is kind of like a good way you look at the scholars, the way they teach undergrad, the way they teach these kids, they have some knowledge. And that is why there's also good side scholars do in understanding Holocaust. Holocaust couldn't be known if scholars were not actually out there teaching about it. The teaching of Holocaust has been part of the curriculum. The Cambodia, the former Yugoslavia, the Darfur, all these are taught in school. But again, the problem is being the bad apples. The bad apples are the people you can see that they are everywhere. I don't want to kind of like give these faces here because I remember like if you look at these researcher, I think Dr. Yusta was talking about the numbers behind the genocide. Although numbers do not really matter in defining whether genocide has happened because killing one person will be enough to prove that genocide has happened as long as there is the intent to destroy the ethnic group or the group that has been defined, the group that is protected. So why play with the numbers? Because with the numbers, somebody may just do that for research, for the sake of, we're talking about professors, need tenure, you have to publish, and everything is research. So some of these are kind of, and then also some of the scholars. So the problem with that is that, and this is maybe the point I want to also emphasize, is that scholars know, they're actually smart, that they can only play with the area where it's not criminal or not yet defined. But unfortunately, if you look at the First Amendment here and the First Amendment here in the United States, people can, free speech is, hate speech is protected in the United States, right? People can kind of like use hate speech. But in most countries around the world, it is punishable. In Europe, it is punishable. In Canada, it's punishable. In most countries, punishable. So hate speech, actually, the American First Amendment it protects hate speech only in America. But we are living in a place where internet and technology is far advanced. You write something in the United States, you better stay in the United States. Because you cross the street, you go to Canada, you go to Europe, they will get you because the act you committed will still be punishable outside. So scholars have to now make a choice between, I write what I want to write, meaning I just like prostitute myself and write whatever negative and things I want to kind of like destroy. But you have to understand that in some of most countries, they punish hate speech and denial genocide. So the genocide denial is also punished in most countries outside the United States. So this is a very important thing to understand. But also in the United States, there is also what people have to understand, that the element of marketplace of ideas. It's a very good idea that is an American understanding that you can speak up your mind. And you have to allow the other people also to speak. And then, just like in the market, if you bring rotten tomatoes, nobody will buy them. If you bring good tomatoes, people buy them. So what ended up happening, and which actually works in the United States but not work in other countries, that you rotten tomatoes, meaning denial, genocide, hate speech, you can come and use it in the public. And then another person will use the speech that is constructive, that is teaching about prevention, and then the numbers will be very clear. So if you know that your speech is just like the rotten tomatoes, you'll not hear people listening to you. And then, of course, being humans, you need to move back to the positive side. So this is what the U.S. academia kind of is counting on. Let people speak, let people use the hate speech if they want. If their speech is not being listened to, they'll realize that they are making a mistake, and then they'll switch and be on the positive side. But that does not happen all the time, because people, the speech that is already sent has been listened to by other people. And most of the time, people who are able to harm others. And this is why struggling with the First Amendment, struggling with the free speech in the United States, for somebody who has been a victim of genocide, who has been victim of Holocaust, it's very difficult to be on this side. In the US, they have allowed a Holocaust denier to go and walk in Illinois and wearing these Nazi everything and show that this is a protected speech. But this is an American understanding. And it is based on this understanding that people will choose what is right, what is wrong. And the United States has never been tested like Europe has been tested, the way Rwanda has been tested. And you can understand this understanding. But if you're sitting here in the United States and you listen to some AM radios about hate and everything, for some people will say, I can just hear the RTLM somehow being broadcasted somewhere in these United States. But the problem is that the government is strong, it can protect other citizens. But sometimes government is not strong, like in poor country, developing country, to do that. So that's why I believe it's very important to keep in mind that as much as there is an academic freedom, there is a free speech, there is also the responsibility of scholars. And that comes also the responsibility of institutions where the scholars are based. I give you the example, for instance, of one scholar. So this scholar who was connected to university, it took a lot of scholars to prove to him that the research methodology he used in Rwanda was not correct. the methodology of how you use in Rwanda, you're going to watch 1, 2, 3 people, and then draw a conclusion. So we wrote letters to institutions, we talked to the scholars and everything, and it ended up being accepted by SAI. But this is the United States, so it's very important to keep in mind that when you are discussing with the scholar, you acknowledge that he is a free speech, his academic freedom protected, but also other people have the capacity to speak. But in other countries, people don't have that opportunity. That's why in Rwanda, it's very important to look at it from the perspective that punishing a denial of genocide, punishing hate speech is important. Why? Because we have been there and we know that allowing hate speech to prosper, allowing a genocide denial to prosper is again leading to the point that was mentioned, to the next genocide. So the only way to prevent genocide is to make sure that that stage of genocide doesn't become a vicious circle where end up being another point where ending it is very important. So sorry that I had to go on and on, but I'm very...
Thank you very much. And I will introduce our final speaker so that we can get into Q&A, who will be speaking about, who's one of the good apples, speaking about the role of genocide education, both in museum settings and within the classroom. I'm happy to introduce Kelly Sazani, who's the Vice President of Education and Exhibitions and provides strategic leadership and planning for education initiatives and exhibitions. Some major recent initiatives have included the development of content and education framework of the groundbreaking Take a Stand Center, which is an award-winning exhibit on Holocaust survival stories and experiences. And during her 16-year tenure, Ms. Sazani has become recognized as a leading human rights and museum educator. She has won multiple awards for her educational and human rights work, including the Samuel Goldstein Award from the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago and the Damon Award from the Graduate School at Loyola University in Chicago. She is the author of Teaching the 1994 Rwandan Genocide Through Stanton's 8 Stages and The Power of Story, teaching about genocide through literary circles. And she has an upcoming book published about teaching about the Rwandan genocide. She holds a BA in the history from Kennesaw College and a master's in public history from Loyola University, where her areas of study were in education and focused on the trajectory of memory in Holocaust museums and memorials. Looking forward to your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a tremendous honor to be with all of you here today. I would especially like to thank the Rwandan-American community of the Midwest, USA, and the Peace Center for Forgiveness and Reconciliation, as well as acknowledge Immaculée for inviting me today. My life has been truly blessed to know you for the 10 years, and it's an honor to call you my friend. So thank you for having me here. This afternoon, on behalf of Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, its leadership, our volunteers, our over 1,500 survivors of the Holocaust, I stand in solidarity with each of you. This afternoon, I've been asked to address the topic of genocide education both in museums and the classroom setting, which is a major intersection of my personal and professional work. I hope that some of what I have to say will resonate and that it will help us deepen the understanding about how it applies today and, of course, for our future. But before I go on, I want to situate myself and my work for you. In the second decade of the 21st century, I stand here honored by the work I am able to do each day as a genocide educator. And I spend my days working for an institution that is one of both memory and of action. The mission of our museum is perhaps best expressed in our founding principle, which is remember the past, transform the future. By our very existence, our site, like others, dedicated to the memory and education of genocide, understands that if we are to be genuine in our efforts to honor the memory we seek to preserve, the history and lessons we seek to teach, we must grapple with the past to create a different kind of future. I dedicate my days believing that we can transform our visitors, students, teachers, community leaders, and the diversity of the general public to become advocates for change. I do this work because I believe we must empower our visitors to not only find their voices, but to want those voices to be heard. I want each visitor to leave our museum with a profound understanding of the past, feel they have a powerful stake in the present, and maintain a hopeful eye on their future. I do this work because my life has been blessed by the awesome opportunity to know hundreds of genocide survivors. They have taught me the true meaning of strength and courage and resilience, and of the need to recognize our common responsibility to humanity. They inspire me to continue to educate others, to be guardians of their memory, to bear witness to their stories, and to ensure that their messages of hope and peace for future generations are not forgotten. I do this work so that I can continue to fight hatred and indifference and denial with education, as so many of the survivors in our area of Skokie, Illinois did in the late 1970s, when neo-Nazis threatened to march in Skokie, where at the time over 7,000 survivors of the Holocaust lived. When the peacefulness of their new community was destroyed, they took a courageous stand. They responded by fighting hatred with education and formed an organization called the Holocaust Memorial Foundation of Illinois, our parent organization. Through their efforts, they made the state of Illinois a trailblazer in Holocaust and genocide education, making us the first state in the entire country to mandate the study of the Holocaust in 1990, and in 2005 worked towards the expansion of the mandate to include broader historical and contemporary genocide. So I stand here this afternoon very thankful and aware of not only the work that has been done before us, but ever mindful during this month when we gather in remembrance of the 25th anniversary of the '94 genocide against the Tutsi, and with commemorations across the globe, that the future of genocide education has entered a new era. We are at a crossroads where over the course of 3 generations, a massive field of testimony, documentation, and interpretation has grown around historical and contemporary genocides. And the question is now being asked, how will this history be remembered and taught, not as a static picture of the past, but as a dynamic task for our future? The challenges we face as a museum and education center as we confront a collapsing window of time with each generation between our audiences we reach, the history we teach, it is an awesome and great responsibility. But we also know that education is humanity's most effective tool to create meaningful and lasting change. Effective genocide education teaches there must not only be a historical understanding of the past, but also a human learning of the past. We must trust our students and the visitors that come to our museum to examine history and human behavior in all of its complexities, including the legacies of prejudice and discrimination, indifference and silence, and for those before me that reminded us today, empowering them to be guardians against the ideology of denial. I will share with you what I think are 2 essential components to genocide education. There are, of course, many, as we've heard today, but I want to focus on these 2. First, that is the power of story. And the second, the need for what I like to call a critical imagination, working toward an education of humanity, creating upstanderism. Let me begin with the first, and a story of the Holocaust, if you'll indulge me for a moment. Fritzi, 13, was from Klučarky, Czechoslovakia, where on the last day of Passover in 1944, she and her family were forced to leave their home, taken by rail car to Auschwitz-Birkenau killing center. Fritzi arrived, and one man, skinny with a shaving head and wearing a striped uniform, brushed by the children in the rail car and whispered in Yiddish, "You are 15. Remember, you are 15." By pretending to be older, she was spared certain death. Her Aunt Bella, who had arrived at the camp a few weeks before, offered Fritzi a second saving grace, trading her food to move Fritzi into her barrack, where every night she held Fritzi and told her that tomorrow will be better. Hold on for one more day, that tomorrow will be better. While her aunt saved Fritzi's life, she could not save her own. Within a few weeks after Fritzi's arrival, her aunt was murdered in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. This story is just a fragment of a much longer odyssey, but it reflects a pattern so often found in the many genocide accounts that we hear. The abject brutality of the perpetrator, a brave and desperate act of kindness by people risking their own lives, the will and determination to live, and the unbelievable strength that saved one human being in some of the darkest of times, who also happens to now serve as the president of our museum. Of the 6 million Jews killed during the Holocaust, and of the over 1 million Tutsi killed during the '94 genocide, each one, which has been emphasized today, is a story filled with the same elements, along with their own uniquely complicated twists and turns. Fritzi is just one story. We've heard many today. A story that speaks to the ultimate purpose of genocide education, and it is simply this: to tell the story. This should be the central vehicle and starting point of genocide education. Each victim, remember that 1 + 1 + 1 that's already been spoken about, represents a story, a human life, albeit a story and life cut short in their own right. As we move further away from the genocides of Nazi Europe, Rwanda, Darfur, Syria, Myanmar, it is these individual stories, along with those of the survivors, that I hope are the focal point of genocide education. Indeed, Illinois Holocaust Museum and other institutions from across the world are deeply engaged in preserving the stories of the Holocaust and those of other genocide survivors. I continue to encourage the Rwandan community to speak, to record, to write, to ask questions of survivors and eyewitnesses, so that we will see children and grandchildren of survivors telling the stories of their parents and grandparents. To tell the story will need to be the key future of the continued awareness and knowledge of the '94 genocide against the Tutsi. Now to my second component, the education of humanity. We need an education that addresses why human beings make war, destroy lives, brutalize, and devalue others, and put national interest above humaneness. We need an education that teaches the common humaneness of the other, an education that stresses the values of caring and emphasizes a personal responsibility and compassion, an education that prepares the individual for doing acts of good. I know that's a very tall order to ask of education, but it is vital to draw attention to the importance of teaching why ordinary people become perpetrators, as well as the importance of teaching why other ordinary people risk everything, sometimes their lives, to help their fellow human beings during a genocide. Of course, again, teaching about genocide in the classroom or through a museum must involve discussions of the antecedents or the stages, historical overviews of the who, what, where, when, and why. But we must also roll up our sleeves and ask difficult questions, challenging questions, have uncomfortable conversations. We must ask questions about ethics and resistance and responsibility, personal and political choice. To paraphrase genocide scholar John Roth, genocide continues to illustrate how difficult it is for good people to move from knowledge to recognition of what the killers are doing, to comprehension of the significance of their horrendous atrocities, then to action armed at thwarting the genocide successfully. Ultimately, a more concentrated worldwide movement is needed, but I think we can all agree it must start somewhere. And ultimately, genocide education, whether in a formal or informal setting like a museum, must teach us that we have to ultimately pave the way for a larger, more powerful effort along these lines. If we can learn and teach something about the nature of people like Raoul Wallenberg and Irina Sendler and Oskar Schindler during the Holocaust, we can also teach about Carl Wilkins and Romeo Dallaire and everyday Rwandans who risked their own lives to save their neighbors. As genocide education, we can do more than merely help our audiences understand these issues involved. We can help them develop values that are rooted in the humane conception of justice and equality. Our students or visitors must choose for themselves the values by which to live and principles upon which to act. But we can help them to develop an understanding and an appreciation of our values and principles as they identify and clarify their own. We can challenge them to determine which, if any, human rights issues they care about and what, if anything, they will do to translate their concerns into action. Perhaps then teaching about genocide will be well worth the effort we expand. In closing, it is through this combination of individual story and critical imagination that creating an education of humanity and responsibility, we can provide our audiences with the tools necessary to explore the precarious nature of human and civil rights and how easily they can be denied and stripped away. We can investigate the dynamics and relationships that make up our diverse communities, what influences our decisions to be bystanders, but also what encourages us to be upstanders. So this afternoon, as I began with a story, I would like to end with a story. In his article, Story and Silence, Transcendence and the Work of Elie Wiesel, author Gary Henry tells the story of a righteous man who came to Sodom. He knew what Sodom was, so he tried to save it from destruction. He preached to the people, please do not be murderers. Do not be silent. Do not be indifferent. He went preaching day after day, but no one listened. He was not discouraged, and he went on preaching for years. Finally, someone asked him, why do you do that? Don't you see it is of no use? He said, I know it is of no use, but I must, and I will tell you why. In the beginning, I thought I had to protest and shout in order for them, in order to change them. I have given up this hope because now I know I must scream and shout so that they do not change me. Today, may we be inspired to raise our voices, shatter the silence, to scream and shout so that the world does not change us, but rather that we, united, continue our important work. That we can look back 40, 50, 60 years from now having changed and shaped a better and more peaceful world. Perhaps this will be the greatest legacy of the work that we do. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly, for the important work the museum is doing in telling the stories of many genocide and Holocaust survivors and memorializing their stories in this collapsing window of time while we still have them. And now I would like, in the interest of time, to turn it to the audience. We will have time for just 2 questions If I could please just ask you to get to the question right away and then give the chance to our panelists to have some time for robust discussion.
My question has to deal with the role of education in the press. We talked about the press earlier, I think in the morning session, and just recently now with education and so on. And I clearly recall the circumstances of '94, shortly thereafter, and also that Bill Clinton has professed apologies for not coming to the aid of the Rwandans, the Tutsis, and so on. And yet, I think a year or so later, he came to the aid of the Serbians and the Croatians during that particular thing by way of the United Nations. I'm just curious as to how it came that historically one was ignored, the other was not, and also in the context of the complexity of these issues. We as Americans like to do sound bites. We like to have things simplified. The story in Central Africa was an extremely complicated one. When I was in my mid-30s and busy raising my 3 children, working full-time, trying to be a husband and what have you, the last thing I had to do was try to understand a complex story going on in Africa. Even though I clearly recall the story at great length, I struggled to understand the Serbian-Croatian situation. To this day, I don't understand it. So many of these things, I feel like the press, as journalists, and we all know that sadly journalism has died with the advent of social media and what have you, but what I really struggle with is how we as a people can be better educated so that we can put the pressure on people such as our president, as our politicians, to actually act when we are devastated by what we are hearing and seeing overseas. And yet, again, you know, the stories were so complicated, nobody really did a good job of explaining it to us.
Thank you. Would any of our panelists like to take the question around how to better be educated and informed around things that are going on all over the world when we have short attention spans and quick sound bites? There are mics that are around you on the tables.
I mean, just one thing I can say is that when anything like that happens, there is a first responsibility is to protect, and then try to figure out who is good, who is bad. But when humans are being killed, the first responsibility, and they're very simple, it's easy to see who is killing who. The first responsibility is politicians, get them stopped, and then we figure out who is right, who is wrong. And I think that's very simple. American people can do very easily. When you look at in Syria, look at Rohingya people, just who is killing who immediately and then stop them and then figure that out. Because if you start going to who is good guy, who is bad guy, is a good guy killing bad guys or whatever, this is not a movie, this is real lives.
Well, thank you. I think I wouldn't disagree at all. As you rightly say, sometimes the media goes and informs us. You know, discourse is what shapes how we understand things. So they will choose to call some of the people who are also killing, they will choose to give them names that make them appear as though it's okay. I think the human aspect of it is it can never be okay for anyone to die. Politics is not about death, at least from my understanding and from my experience. Death is about, we all have a duty to protect. I would absolutely agree that can we ask the real human questions? Because it can never be wrong that babies have to die. It can never be wrong that people who have no political name die in the name of politics. People whose religious name is not known die in the name of religion. I think one thing that has really gone wrong with media at times is that the way they present the story sometimes makes us feel like it's okay for some people to die. I think the biggest starting point is it can never be okay for people to die except if it's just their natural death. And I think that's the most human part of the question. Can we start by saying, no, it doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree. Disagreement is not equivalent to death. Can we protect death? And then the rule of law is about having institutions that make the right judgments. At least I want to believe that the rule of law will stay globally. We give it the opportunity to judge. Because whether we act or not, in the end, we judge. And unfortunately, sometimes we judge with regret. Because if we had just thought that was a human being to survive, we would have given them the opportunity, and then judgment comes thereafter. Thank you.
Specifically to the point of how do we better educate ourselves? Speaking from the American's perspective here, it's simply a matter of looking beyond our own borders. Absolutely, we have our own issues in our country. But much of what we see through the media is very American-centric. Many of the scholars I work with who are from Europe, from Central Africa, are acutely aware of what goes on beyond their national borders. And it's our responsibility to broaden our own horizons and to recognize that there's a whole lot more going on in the world than just what's going on in our White House and our Capitol building.
Clearly, he knew what was going on. Clearly, he couldn't unilaterally send troops into the country. He needed to form some type of coalition similar to what is done with Bush and what have you, with some of these things going on in the Middle East and elsewhere. So in part, I don't want to put the blame on Clinton as well. The United Nations obviously failed as well, which means many other countries who were equally as knowledgeable about what was going on, or more knowledgeable, as you're pointing out, they failed as well in terms of actually alerting the United Nations about this problem, and we've got to act quickly on this. It's amazing that it ended after 3 months. I'm not sure. Please help me. How did it end? This thing could have gone on for quite some time, and 3 months to kill off 1 million people is astounding. When Hitler took how many years to kill off 6 million?
12.
12 for Hitler, yes.
So I just wanted to say make three very, very quick points, because I know we're almost out of time. To Marcus's point, I think it's letting people understand that it doesn't have to be an either-or thing. You can care about the issues in your own community and your neighborhood, and you can also care about the issues halfway across the world. And some people think they have to choose. Second, I think coming from a state that has a Holocaust and genocide mandate, in all the best ways, I am not a huge fan of mandates, because ultimately a mandate means nothing if we're not teaching and training our educators of how to appropriately and accurately teach about genocide. And as someone who was very involved in the early 2000s with the Save Darfur movement, I watched young people across the Chicagoland area write Save Darfur on their sneakers, on their backpacks, wear the cool green bracelets, and were really involved. But when you asked them where Darfur was, they thought it was a country, right? In the country of Africa, right? No geographical awareness, no idea of who the players were. And so if we're going to create an anti-genocide constituency, you have to create an educated anti-genocide constituency. And it is the role of educators and teachers to have young people be able to look at what's going on in the news, to what Marcus says, and say, hey, that seems like stage 4 or stage 3 or stage 6, right, in genocide, so that they become educated, to understand that change doesn't happen overnight. We have a generation, right, that's instant gratification and wants change now. Change sometimes takes time. And I would say third, to the political point, there has never been a political candidate has won a campaign on the promise of broad humanitarian effort, right? But yet, every single president that's been elected here in the United States, from Carter to Obama in their memoir, has said their greatest regret is when they didn't intervene in a genocide, right? So we as Americans have to understand that there should be a political price for our politicians for not intervening. We have to show them at the ballot box that their decision, whether senator, congressperson, whatever it is, not to intervene, to help refugees, to help intervene or stop a genocide, that it will cost them their office. And we haven't gotten there yet, unfortunately.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone here. I would love to keep the conversation going. It's getting really good and meaty, but I don't want to take up too much time of our other panel that is following this. And so I did want to thank our panelists, and we can definitely keep the conversation going in the Q&A next round. But now I would like to invite up our other panelists for the second session. Thank you so much, panelists. It was really great.
Good afternoon. We're starting immediately with our session 4 for today. I'm Carlos Bichette. I'm a JSD student here at Notre Dame Law School. I have the pleasure to moderate this panel today. And as we look forward in our afternoon session, most of the discussion has centered around past issues. And this is a fascinating panel with some fascinating speakers talking about some issues with historical background, but looking forward into the future about forgiveness and sustainable peace. So we're going to dive in immediately into our panel. We're going to have a short Q&A session afterwards, so I would like the panelists to remind them that they have around 12 minutes to tackle each of the issues. And we're going to start with our first panelist that's going to talk about the importance of forgiveness, Mr. Kisito Kalima. First of all, I'm going to introduce Mr. Kalima. Mr. Kisito Kalima is a genocide survivor and the founder executive director of the Peace Center for Forgiveness and Reconciliation. Public speaker and an advocate for genocide survivors. In 2014, he had the pleasure of sharing his story at the United Nations headquarters. He is the 2018 D. Susan Wisely Award winner, Youth Worker of the Year for helping the refugees, youth, second-generation genocide survivors. He's going to speak to us today about the importance of forgiveness. Mr. Kalima, the floor is yours.
Hello. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you so much for introduction. So when I was looking at the program, I saw the importance of forgiveness. So the question should have been, why did I forgive? Because forgiveness, it's personal, it's individual. So I forgive so I can live and stop surviving. So when you survive, you are suffering and you are struggling. And the best gift you can give to your enemy or your oppressor or perpetrator, in our case, it's letting him or her controlling you psychologically. Because most of us survivors, most of us people went through genocide. We had a struggle. We had our own mental health issues. I'm proud to say that I was diagnosed with PTSD. It's not something you want to deal with. But my PTSD was pretty much based on my own self, not letting it go. So I decided to forgive because I want to live. And God knows that after I forgave, I regained the family I lost. I regained the house I lost. And above all, I regained the inner peace. So in simple words, the importance of forgiveness it's when you find out the forgiveness, it's freeing a prisoner, as somebody said, and finding out that prisoner was you. So that's my message to you today, that forgiveness is good for all of us. It's the only justice can a survivor give to himself or herself. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your participation, especially on the issue of forgiveness and its individual or collective performance, right? Our second speaker for today, it's going to be Amber Mays. She's going to speak to us about the role of good leadership in peace building. Amber Mays is the Holocaust Education and Program Coordinator for the Jewish Federation of Greater Indianapolis, in a full-time position shared in equal partnership with the Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center. She's responsible for overseeing Holocaust education for the Indianapolis Jewish community and providing Holocaust education resources and programming to students, teachers, and the general community in Central Indiana. She received a Bachelor of Arts degree in Anthropology from Ball State University and a Master's degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Stockton University in Pomona, New Jersey. Ms. Mays, the floor is yours.
Lower this from Z there. Okay. Thank you all for being here. I know it's been a long day where we've had a lot of unpacking to do, so I appreciate you staying here. I'm very honored to be here today as well. This topic is a little outside of my wheelhouse, but it is a topic I witnessed firsthand when I was able to work with the Enough Project. So I'll be discussing with you today the role of leadership in strategic peace building. So I guess the first question is, what is strategic peace building? Peace building requires a holistic approach. It has to be multifaceted, require cooperation between all levels of society, may not often start out this way. However, one level may push that second level to begin its own efforts. Peace building also aims to manage, mitigate, resolve, and transform central aspects of conflict. This is typically done through several ways, either official diplomacy or other multilateral efforts, nonviolent social change, civil society peace processes, and dialogue, conflict, resolution strategies. It is essential within peace building to address the root causes of violence. Is it land redistribution, natural resources, political instability, ethnic tensions? These are all essential questions. And we must foster reconciliation through transitional justice, restorative justice, and trauma healing, again, at a holistic level. Peace building seeks to change the structures and institutions of a post-conflict society by improving the education and development sectors and establishing a government or legal system that is better able to cope with transnational and global threats. And all of these pieces must be able to move together. So these are the different areas of leadership. A lot of times we like to think of leadership as the top only, and that is not the case. Of course, we do have our governmental institutions, our prime ministers, presidents, politicians. However, in most post-conflict societies, governmental frameworks have broken down. You have civil society organizations, so nonprofits, NGOs, labor unions, religious institutions, and local authorities, and the private sector. In order to create sustainable peace, leaders need to emerge from all sectors of society. Civil society organizations must partner with the private sector to initiate change at the local and national governmental levels. So what makes an effective leader? What are some characteristics that define an effective leader within peace building? First thing, national interests must be placed above personal agendas, recognizing that the needs of the collective society are more important than your own wants and needs. This often is the cause of renewed violence in a post-conflict society, and it's essential for an effective leader to exercise self-discipline and promote unity. We have to integrate universal ideals into community values. So what that means is an effective leader is able to effectively take the overarching universal ideas of governance and integrate it into local values and customs. Pursue holistic visions. So engaging with all sectors of society, and has the ability to adequately communicate and persuade people to see the merits of a holistic peace. Understanding and leveraging polarities. So a polarity within peace building is a dilemma that will be ongoing and does not have a right or the best solution. However, thinking of peace and conflict or change and stability as direct dichotomies can impede the peace process. And of course, balancing the past with the future. And what I mean by that is that there is certainly the need to act on past injustices, but it is important not to linger on past failures. It is important to focus on pursuing a united future. Understanding the failure of previous long-term peace efforts. I just said that an effective leader should not linger in the actions of the past. However, the root causes of the previous failures towards sustainable peace should be fundamentally understood. If not, those same processes that emerged in previous peace efforts will do so again and cast a shadow on future efforts. And the last and probably the most important is that an effective leader assumes the responsibility to do no harm. This is central to any peace effort. It is not uncommon in post-conflict societies for leaders in any sector to abuse their newfound influence. This is by no means a comprehensive list. There are many factors that make up effective leadership. However, research of leaders within post-conflict societies, these characteristics consistently emerge. So I want to take a moment just to briefly discuss some leaders, not within Rwanda, but within still the African continent. First example of a leader is Dika Ibrahim Abdi. She was moved to action at the outbreak of violence in her community of Wajir, Kenya. Using traditional methods of conflict resolution, she was instrumental in bringing about peace. Understanding that 50% of peace initiatives fail, she established the Wajir Peace and Development Committee to bring together governmental, civil society, religious, and local authority leaders to ensure that the agreement was implemented. So, peace leadership is often approached from a top-down model, where elite agencies dictate to local leaders how they should or should not handle a peace process. This method has been found to be ineffective compared to when there is rather from a top-down to a bottom-up approach. Dr. Jeremy Weinstein of Stanford University discovered that 75% of civil wars in which an international agency intervened resumed within 10 years of stopping. Political scientist Dr. Roland Paris analyzed 11 UN missions in depth and determined that only 2 were able to build sustainable peace. This is due to multinational and international agencies trying to apply a cookie-cutter model to peace building, which often does not align with the ideals and customs of the post-conflict community. I'm not saying that international agencies should be cut out of the peace process. Rather, that they should embrace the leaders within civil society and garner a holistic understanding of what processes work within a particular culture. Leaders at the very top should strengthen the capacity of leaders at the ground level. Inclusivity is essential to ensuring sustainable peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amber, for that presentation. Indeed, the strong role of leadership in peace processes is one of the most important parts in order to have robust and good outcomes in relation to peace processes. Our next presenter was already with us here in the previous panel, but in order, I see some new people coming in, so we are going to do a brief introduction again. Marcus Steiner is the program coordinator of Candles and joined staff in January 2019. He has an undergraduate degree in business from Indiana State University, a graduate degree in history from Arizona State University, and is currently pursuing a doctorate in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Gratz College. In this panel, Marcus is going to be discussing the issue of teaching unity and reconciliation to promote peace.
So, given all of the heavier topics we've gotten to examine today, I'm very excited to be able to do a little bit more of an uplifting presentation, specifically focusing on individuals who have been dedicated to peace. First, I will be remiss not to mention Eva Moses Kaur. Eva is a Holocaust survivor and the founder of the Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center. She is a forgiveness and human rights advocate who has been working for the last almost 35 years to uncover the actions of the Nazis in Auschwitz-Birkenau and Auschwitz I. She is a lecturer on forgiveness and self-healing and preaches a philosophy of internal peace through self-healing, specifically through forgiveness. Next is Nadia Murad. Nadia is a Yazidi genocide survivor. She is the founder of Nadia's Initiative and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. She is the first UN Goodwill Ambassador for the dignity of survivors of human trafficking. She is also an advocate for all genocide survivors and preaches peace through advocacy. Matthew Smith is the founder and CEO of Fortify Rights. He focuses much of his work on actively working to end the Rohingya genocide ongoing in Myanmar and surrounding areas. He, like Nadia, is an advocate for all genocide survivors. Much of what he does is he reports on the actions of the Burmese regime and the work they are doing against the Rohingya. His major focus is promoting peace through awareness. Greta Thunberg, she is a 16-year-old climate activist. She's an environmental activist, TED speaker, and as of last month, a Nobel Peace Prize nominee for 2019. She is the unintentional founder of the School Strike for Climate movement and preaches a model of peace through the environment, which I'll touch on a little bit later. Yasmin Ullah, she is a Rohingya refugee. She and her family fled Rakhine State and lived in a refugee camp until going to Canada in 2011. She is the current president of the Rohingya Human Rights Network, research coordinator for the Free Rohingya Coalition, and the co-director of HAMDA, which is helping all Muslims of different abilities. Through her work, she promotes peace building through recognition. Dr. Christy Yoder. She is actually a former wildlife biologist. She is the executive director and founder of the Center for Genocide Research and Education based in Longmont, Colorado. She is a human rights advocate focused heavily on Eastern Asia and the Middle East, though she also does conduct work and research in Central Africa. Her main research focuses on genocide indicators and works to educate on mass atrocity prevention and awareness through a local level grassroots system. Her main focus is promoting peace through education. Charlotte Olson, she is a member of the organization STAND. She is the founder of the Terre Haute, Indiana chapter of March for Our Lives. She's a gun control and human rights activist and preaches peace through activism. So why did I choose these individuals? First and foremost is to show the scope of peacemaking. Peacemaking is not limited to any particular age group, any particular background, or any particular geographic or topical scope. We look everywhere from an 85-year-old Holocaust survivor to a 16-year-old Scandinavian girl. Everything from an individual who is a wildlife biologist to a genocide survivor from the Middle East. And in terms of scope, everything from a high schooler focusing on trying to make Indiana schools safer through gun rights activism, to a young woman who is working to literally heal the earth we live on. And the big takeaway that I hope you can all have from this brief presentation is To build peace, we do not have to focus on solving all the world's problems. We don't have to focus on solving the biggest problems in the world. As long as each and every individual does what they can do based off their skill set and their passions, together we can promote and we can build and will build a more peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for showing us those important examples of individuals who work for peace every day in our lives. And lastly, in our panel, we have the intervention again of Mr. Quisito Kalima. Quisito has already been introduced to all of us. He's already shared part of his story on forgiveness. And right now, he's going to speak to us about teaching unity and reconciliation to promote peace.
All right, thank you so much. I think I'm going to sit down. I'm too tall for the podium. So I'm going to sit down. Thank you so much, man. Thanks for giving me a chance to talk about reconciliation and unity. So as Rwandans, we know exactly that we are family first. That the genocide came to us, or the killing came to us. It is something that we, all of us from different tribes, Hutu and Tutsis, whatever it is, whatever it was, it is something we don't have an explanation for. I don't know anybody in a Rwandan community who's not mixed or have somebody connected to the Hutu or Tutsi tribe. So anytime I'm teaching about reconciliation and the unit, I always go back to the drawing board. I always go back to pre-colonial. I always tell people that I never learned or heard any history of Rwanda before the colonialism, anything about genocide or people killing each other because of Hutu and the Tutsis. So once we go back, because most of the young generation, most of us, or younger than me, we grew up in an era where we were taught about the Hutu and Tutsis, like I guess Takamatali talked about it, about the, people come from Ethiopia and others. So those brainwashing studies we had create this, I would say, this illusion among ourselves. But if you go back and realize that we're all one person, that's where we are able to explain to someone that we can reconcile and we can unite. Because at the end of the day, I remember vividly that the genocide ended officially July 19, I believe, right? I know somebody I grew up with. By August 1st, the first week of August, she was getting married to the Hutu person. And if there's nothing you can explain, I don't know how many people who've been hating for so long, each other, killing each other, that after a week or two, they're now in love again. You know why? Because they found out that even before the genocide, they were one person. They didn't have any differences until the politician imposed all these theories to all of us. So teaching reconciliation in the unit, you have to pretty much break it down, the history of Rwanda, especially in the Rwandan community, because most of young people are always referred to what they know. So we didn't know anything about the pre-colonial era. We didn't know exactly what it was, and that's what ended up leading to the genocide. So coming back to the topic is that when I'm teaching reconciliation and unit, I always have to teach the real history of Rwanda. If you get a chance, you guys can go back to outside. We have a little exhibit for our organization, and it is something I've seen. It works. It works because most of us, as I mentioned before, we didn't know anything other than the Hutu and the Tutsis coming from Ethiopia and coming from Chad, whatever it was. So that propaganda made us separate and ended up leading to the killings that most of us are now suffering as the victims of it. But we were able to move forward, and with our current leadership in Rwanda, the reconciliation, unit, and it's there. It's written, it's law, it's legal, so it's up to all of us, the Rwandans, to put those, those words in action to make sure we don't have another genocide or prevent the future massacres. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all the panel's interventions. They've been really helpful, especially for our topic today as we look forward towards reconciliation and peace building in Rwanda and in Greater Africa, in the world. Right now, we have some time for Q&A. If anyone would like to step up, the mics are over there. And we have our first question here for the panelists.
Thank you so much. Once again, my name is Tony from Uganda. This debate really interests me as we try to find a lasting solution. I would like to relate this to the present events happening in not just Rwanda, but in Rwanda, Uganda, DRC. And my question then would be, do they point towards a recurrence of a situation similar to genocide? For example, we have groups, militia groups of Rwandese people in DR Congo, in Uganda, and some are not militia, but they claim that they have been marginalized. They claim that they have been marginalized. And these are claims, these are not my assertions, but this continues to play out. So when we have such events occurring right now, when we are actually supposed to be commemorating and looking forward to a good future, do we not have a cause to worry? Thank you.
So if I understand your question right, you asking about the people who are being marginalized?
They claim that they're marginalized. Actually, some
by who?
Rebel groups.
By who? Do they say who marginalized them?
They claim that the government in Rwanda has marginalized them. Some are in Uganda, some are in DR Congo. Actually, some are even apply for refugee status.
So I got you, man. Let me ask you a question real quick. All right. In Rwanda, everybody's welcomed. So, and if you feel like you're marginalized, it's because of your personal issues, right? So there's people who commit genocide. So, of course, they are deniers. They are the biggest deniers. They are well-funded. They have money. They are educated. So, of course, it's the last stage of a genocide. They have to deny. They have to come up with what else should they, are they going to say? They have to use a political tool. Those who are applying for refugee status, man, they're trying to find a better life. Trust me, I know. Because I work with a lot of refugees, and most of them, they have to claim something. So, if you know one of them, we got a guy from embassy here. I do believe he can help you out. He can help them to go back to Rwanda, because if you decide to go back and you mind your business, of course, we have zero tolerance of hatred and division, because we know exactly what it is. I mean, what happened? We don't want any genocide. So maybe the thing is about as African, I don't think we understand the real terms of democracy. So democracy has become this general, broader definition that everybody has to say whatever he wants to say. But in our case, there's something we may say and may lead to a genocide. Even here in America, I bet you there's no white person who's going to kind of go on TV and say N-word. You know why? Because it's a derogatory term. Those who feel like they're marginalized, they're hiding behind something, or they're running for something. We know exactly that if they have a platform and they want to share their thoughts, there's a means and a way they can do it. So my answer to you is that we are open country, and as I said, if they want to go back, and they can go claim their political issues, but if they want to fight, I'm not going to advise them to fight, because they will regret, I'm telling you. Trust me. Thank you.
The floor is open for subsequent questions. I don't know if anyone wants to approach. Yeah, we have one here.
First, thank you so much for being here, everyone. So I just started teaching business negotiations at the university I work at, and I used the Gacaca courts to talk about mediation. But I think, very reasonably worried about not being sensitive and not being appropriate in how I talk about the genocide that led up to the Gacaca courts. Does anyone have any tips for me on how to be as sensitive and respectful as I can be? Did that make sense?
So something I found, so I work comparative genocide, so I work with survivors from Darfur to Myanmar. If you have a survivor to whom you can speak, I'm lucky enough to have Kizito. If you are concerned about whether your approach is insensitive, ask. Say, this is how I'm approaching this. Is there a better way? And believe, at least with Z, he has no issue saying yes, no, absolutely. And I see a lot of nodding heads in the audience as well. So 100%, there's no shame in asking. Indeed, it's better to acknowledge our own ignorance towards these multicultural issues than it is to just kind of go in blind.
No? Perfect. Any other questions right now? I was actually wanted to abuse my moderator's privilege here on a particular question because it's interesting, the panel about forgiveness and peace building in this particular thing. And there's a lot written about the correlation between these two aspects, right? So to all of you, if you want to jump in the question, do you think there should be forgiveness in order to be peace, in order to have peace building, or should the other one exclude the other one? So how do we really have a peace building without forgiveness, or can we have peace in the negative sense and that would be enough for the restoration of relationships in Rwanda or in the world in general?
Okay, so quick answer is that forgiveness is, as I say, is an individual, and when you talk of peace, there's a physical peace and inner peace. I don't know which one you may be asking, but if you're talking about the physical peace, like outside, when nobody's shooting at each other, that's possible. That's very possible without reconciliation. I mean, without forgiveness, because if you can walk in the street and you can go anywhere you want from 24 hours, that's fine. That's kind of be done. But a long-lasting peace, it's inner peace, where individuals can decide their own fate, right? When individuals kind of say, "Oh, I'm not going to be manipulated. I'm not going to be used to hate my neighbor because of she or he is different tribe or whatever, different skin color." So yes, there can be peace. When I say peace without forgiveness, physical peace. There are police out there in every corner and nobody's shooting each other. But real peace we promote, especially in our organization, is an inner peace, a peace of your heart and your soul, to make sure that at least, you can make your own decision based on how you feel and what you want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And to touch on Kizito's first presentation today, forgiveness is a very personal thing. Forgiveness is internal. By no means would a survivor choosing to forgive for themselves speak for a whole population. And along that line, a population can choose to sue for peace without forgiving or forgetting what has occurred to them. It's a matter of touching now on Amber's, what is best for the collective versus what's best for an individual. It may be best for an individual to hold into the animosity. That's how they cope, but that's not necessarily best for the collective. So yes, it's absolutely possible, and I would say oftentimes more common to see peace in the absence of whole-scale forgiveness.
I would have to agree with my colleagues, but I would also just have to kind of expand on that a little bit as well, that you mentioned negative peace. And negative peace does not lend towards sustainable strategic peace. Again, echoing Kizito and Marcus, that forgiveness is very personal. I would never come up to a survivor and say, in order for your country to have lasting, sustainable peace, you have to forgive. It's an individual choice. At the same time, if as a collective we focus so much on the pain of our past and we continue to hold on to that anger, we're only going to perpetrate conflicts in the future. So it's possible. It's possible to have that physical peace of forgiveness, peace, yes, without forgiveness. However, I feel that sustaining strategic peace requires an element of collective forgiveness.
We have some more time for other questions. You can just go directly to the mic and present your question to the panelists.
Just a comment and a question. I am concerned about trauma, and I work a lot as a clinical therapist with trauma. And I think there is a very important aspect about forgiveness and inner healing. Because when I look at communities, we are all wounded and struggling with trauma at several levels. And sometimes communities begin to tilt. And it reaches a point where it explodes, and then things are restored. And then it may begin to tilt the other way. Especially when there are multiple levels of trauma over years, and you add not just that, but when you deal with, trauma at the family level, trauma at the cultural level, trauma at all this. And when you look at, for example, what happens even in this country, with the polarization that has arisen recently, then you begin to wonder, with all the data we are collecting about Holocaust and all that kind of thing, are we not learning anything? But sometimes there is a fertile ground when sometimes some people in some sectors begin left out, particularly when you look at rural America. Some things have been happening and slowly we ignore that. And then when something came out, it was easy to be able for somebody to talk a language that somebody else feels like I've been marginalized. And so things changed because there was enough of the people that were feeling left out. So my question is, how do we watch for these indicators? That sometimes everything may be okay. Economy may be booming great, but where is that money going? Now we can look at the GDP and all this, but there are some people that GDP is not affecting. There may be some people somewhere that are feeling uneasy. How do we watch, not at the major indicators, but some of the things that may be underground, under the table, that may lie to us, and then everything goes against all the projections of all the knowledge that we have? What do we do to be able to look at some of the sectors that we are not looking at? Or even when he mentioned about that, how do we not dismiss that but say, okay, let's listen? That's my question.
That was a long question. That was a very long question, brother. I don't know exactly where to start, but I'm going to try. I'm going to do the best I can. So your question was, what is the indicators of trauma or the trauma? I didn't get it well, but I would like to answer because I'm a survivor of the traumatic events. And knowing the indicators and triggers is that knowing that you can prevent it. So it seems like you're asking some kind of political question or something that relates to politics because there's GDP and all kind of stuff. So anyway, I'm a non-profit organization person, and I talk for a living. That's what I do. I'm not a politician, trust me. But I'm going to answer your question as a human being. So as a human being, is that when people are hungry, the hunger is the source of everything. When people are poor, that's when they want to fight. That's when they hate, because therefore the people can control them using their hunger. So if we want to cure the trouble, especially Africa is facing, just cure the poverty. Because if I have what I need, the basic needs, I don't need your money, I don't need your house. So therefore, why should I hate you? Right? So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but to find out those indicators or whatever it can cause another atrocities is to cure the basics, is to cure to cover the basic needs: housing, shelter, and food. Once we cover all that, trust me, all of us are going to be safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And for our last question, the gentleman here, may you approach the mic. You can approach the microphone.
Thank you so much for the speakers. My colleague Kizito, whom we disagree much about this topic, but it's not a question, it's just a comment, and I would like to hear what you have to say about it. I totally agree with you that forgiveness should be personal. But it's not what I'm seeing back in my country. Sometimes I see people being kind of pushed to forgive and reconcile. You all know this example of what they call village of reconciliation villages, where survivors and their perpetrators, they are put together, and before they get houses in those villages, you have to forgive your perpetrator and then live next to your perpetrator. We have 4,000 houses like that in about 4 villages that they call the reconciliation villages. That kind of example to me is it's a re-traumatization for the survivors. It's not reconciliation. It's not forgiveness. And I would like to hear what you have to say about that. Then I have to say that I don't think that forgiveness is possible in the case of genocide. I'll say why. Somebody who harmed me, I think there should be, if he apologizes, if he repents, and if he expresses remorse, and if he repairs the harm he did, then I will look into forgiveness. But nobody should expect to be forgiven. I don't think I have the capacity to forgive on behalf of my parents. I can't forgive on behalf of somebody who killed my mother. Before the last breath of my mother, she was fighting. She said she took the blood of a hand full of her blood, and she said, "Amaraso yanjye azaguhame. May my blood haunt you." Who am I to forgive on behalf of my mother? Do I have the capacity to do that? I think the only thing I can do is to let the perpetrator face the judgment of God, and pretending to forgive for my mother or for those who harmed other people, I think it's beyond my possibility. I think it's beyond the survivor's possibility. Second, for the reconciliation, I also think it's an irrelevant kind of concept in a society that experienced genocide. I explain why. I think that the state, the churches, they should teach peaceful coexistence. People respecting their rights, people respecting their fellow citizens. But I think it's not fair to kind of push people to reconcile and to forgive, because it doesn't have to do with coexistence. All we need is to live together, but reconciliation, I think it's a mal-placed concept, same thing as forgiveness in the case of genocide. So I would love to hear what you have to say about this. Of course, we do not have to agree, but we respect each other.
Okay, thanks, brother Gasachi. So me and Gasachi go back and forth. Trust me. He put in the public, but on the phone, we always have this debates. And I like that he brought it here, because there's a thing, man. So let me start with the peace villages, or whatever, why people live together. Let me tell you something. Are you Catholic, or what do you believe in? Are you Catholic or Christian? You have a faith? Okay, but why you? So, okay, let me go back. In Rwanda, before we were, when the Catholic Church came, right? They brought all goods, right, to entice us. People have to be taught. People have to be helped. People have to be pushed to do something. You cannot get up in the morning and say, you know what, I'm going to live with this person who killed my family, because that's what it takes a while. So if the government of Rwanda or the people are trying to help, that's a helping. Of course, it's not perfect, but guess what? The genocide was the worst thing ever happened to humanity in our lifetime. So do you have another method? If you have another solution, I do believe you can put it up there, because everyone has a responsibilities to find a solution. I chose forgiveness because I can't stand the justice. I'm a criminal justice major. I worked in the court for 10 years. I put people in prison. I realized there's no victim who leaves the court happy. because it doesn't matter. Imagine if somebody cuts your head off, and your hands off, and you go to court. When you go to court, the judge is supposed to be firm and fair. That means by the time as a victim you get to court, you have lost. Because how can you be firm and fair to somebody who has raped someone? So, to me, the peace villages, what they call them, I do believe it's the first step of reconciliation. It may be not perfect, but it's something to have to do. Because we cannot just sit down there and have people live in whatever Tutsi neighborhood and the Hutu neighborhood. That's another segregation, man. That's what we ended up here. So that is my take on it. It's not perfect. I can agree with that, but at least it's the first step to go somewhere. And as I said, we all, me and you, have responsibilities to find a solution. Instead of seeing negative side of it, let's see how we can correct it. So let's come up with a theory and a way we can maybe make these peace villages, people can make a choice to go live there instead of maybe the government forcing them to go there. Things like that. But so far, to me, I'm okay with what they're doing because it's a first step towards reconciliation. So I do believe the next thing was the forgiveness, forgiving people. Especially your family. As I mentioned, I always tell you, man, forgiveness is not weakness. Forgiveness is not letting people go. Forgiveness is not meaning that I trust you, I love you. Forgiveness is just like because I want to leave. If you know my story, my sister Assunta raised me. She kind of testify. She knows the struggle I was going through, right? But I do believe right now she's proud of me because I sleep. Don't cry. I'm going to cry too. Don't cry. Don't do it. So I sleep. I have a family, man. I'm able to speak. So forgiveness is a therapy. I tried everything. I tried every single therapy I can put my hands on. I never take a medicine. I don't do well the medicine, So anyway, what I can tell you is individuals, yes, forgiveness is the only justice worked for me. And as I told you, I never force anybody to choose to forgive. I always say, this is what I've done. If it works for you, perfect. If it doesn't work, you are entitled to your opinion. But what I'm always asking every survivor, let's find a solution. Let's find a solution. The country is ours. That little country is this big, and we're going to have to live together no matter what. So if me and you keep fighting, trying to criticize what are we doing, instead of correcting, maybe improving what we're doing, we're going to end up just being divided. And I encourage every single person here who wants to live in peace to find a peaceful solution. That is my message to you. And I know we're going to continue this until when. So, and I appreciate that, man. Thank you so much. I guess we're about to be done. Oh, okay.
Thank you very much for that question. For the interest of time, we're going to accept this last question in order to finish. And please go ahead, and if you can jump directly to the question, that would be great.
Yeah, actually, I wasn't going to ask you a question, but I think what I wanted to say, Karima just brought it out. It's about what my brother just lifted up, the peace villages, and made it, presented it as in a concept as if people are forced to forgive before they go into the village. I think that's wrong, but I think what Karima just said is the choice we made as a country. Should we go on having the Tutsi, Hutu, Twa villages? Should we going on having survivor villages and the perpetrators or the families of perpetrators villages? But the idea of saying if who goes into those villages? The starting point is we have vulnerable Rwandans. And the government says we have resources to provide shelter to the most vulnerable Rwandans. So the choice is, there are vulnerable Rwandans who are survivors, and there are vulnerable Rwandans who are not survivors, not necessarily perpetrators or from families of perpetrators. So the idea was, yes, you cater for these as your own, but you can't start building these houses when you're providing for them, and you start going into these stories as whether they are surviving or they are not surviving. So the peace villages, actually the concept is, can we come together as Rwandans, as vulnerable but Rwandans, not minding of what background you have, and we live together. And then what I don't understand again is he has his story. And our president said yesterday, a few days ago, the country to be the country we have today, there was only a group that needed to give something. It was only the survivors that had what to give. They only had to give forgiveness, that we have a country that is more united today. So when we come to you as you to say that to have a country that goes forward, you can start from an angle of coexistence. But I can't refuse a story of Karima, who is a Rwandan, who says, I can't refuse a story of, there are so many survivors around here, who said, I was in bondage, I was in anger, and I forgave. And I am now, I live, I forgive the people who killed my family, I now live with them in peace. So those are individual, as Karima continued to say, forgiveness is individual, unity and reconciliation as a collective, as a country, it's our policy. The policy to make sure as Rwandans, we build something new. We raise a youth, we raise young ones who belong to us as Rwandans, but not to these groups and propagate hatred. I think we can start somewhere and understand where he's coming from. If he has a personal story, that's personal. And we have pastors here who continually pray for us. Those can continue to pray.
It's about common knowledge. Just last week, the person who started this concentration villages, Bishop Buchanan, was here. He confirmed that these villages, before you get a house, you need to forgive and you need to live next to your villages. That is re-traumatization.
No, I think there is a misunderstanding of the argument. These peace villages are not a starting point, they are an end point. I think I should mention that settlement in Rwanda is just like Manzi said, but the project that you are explaining is a misrepresentation of how you present it. There is a group, the bishop you're talking about runs prison fellowship, and they went to the prisons, preached to people, and the people who were preached to wanted to change from a spiritual angle. And one of the ways they pursued their change was to seek forgiveness from the victims. And the prison fellowship arranges them to meet their families. It doesn't happen one day, it doesn't happen in 1 year. It's a whole process. Now, when the forgiveness happens, they choose to relate as human as they can. Some have been married to one another, or they have had their children married. But that's on a personal level. What has happened eventually is, as those groups happened, and the perpetrators who had been in prison were released, the villages emerged. So before they came to the villages, to the settlement villages, they had actually gone back to their villages. It shouldn't be understood as though those people initially were not neighbors. Those people were initially neighbors. People were killed by their neighbors. There has never been a settlement that is far from being neighbors. The resettlement now of making people live in villages in order to access clean water, access a certain level of development, is not a new thing. Because even initially, the perpetrators are neighbors to those they perpetrated. But these villages is a growth of a particular project. You do not have to wake up and be convinced to forgive in order to go back and live with your neighbors. In many times, you will find that your neighborhood actually has been resettled because people are resettling into new villages. So the misrepresentation of forgive and get a house is not the reality of it. Because these people sought forgiveness, they were able to get released from jail, they served their sentences, and now they come back to their communities. Many of the communities have relocated to those villages. It's only, I think, 4 villages that you're mentioning. But it's not a government condition. What Bishop Ruchahana is saying is actually an NGO thing. It's a charity organization that has organized it that way, and government participates in the construction of the houses. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the enriching discussion. Sorry for being such a bad moderator in this particular sense, but I feel that as a non-Rwandan, the discussion was really helpful in order to understand certain aspects and prospects of reconciliation. With those reflections, I think we should end the panel right now. For the interest of time, I think we are a little bit behind schedule. So I would like to thank you, our panelists, with a strong round of applause. And we continue with our schedule for today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carlos. That was great. Who wanted to be able to do something positive during this month of mourning, and they organized themselves to start honoring the victims by walking in solidarity and reflecting on a history that they were learning that they had not been part of. And as such, Rwandans around the world honor this period by participating in walks to remember from Rwanda to everywhere else in the world. And we have scheduled a walk to remember ourselves. This is the 3rd consecutive year that we do a walk to remember. We will be heading to the Morris Performing Arts Center, which is where we will begin the walk. It should be about an hour of the walk. And we will be providing shuttles to get to the Morris Performing Arts Center. The shuttles are located right outside, so all you have to do is head out there, and there are people in the lobby who will direct you to the shuttles. We will have the walk and come back here for a final discussion of message of hope that will start at 6:45. And I look forward to seeing you at the Walk to Remember and later on today. Thank you so much.